Well, thanks very much for coming along, and thanks very much for the invite to come and talk about this. I'm very much going to talk from a climate science point of view, and there won't be very many references to health in this first half of the talk, and I'm going to defer to Becky for lots of the comments about health. Obviously, I've chosen my topics with health in mind, but most of the things that I will say will really be about climate and climate change. So this is really my slide about health, actually. So just to introduce this topic, I'm pretty sure I'm not saying anything too controversial here. So I think humans require certain environmental conditions to survive, and they certainly prefer certain environmental conditions as well to do okay. So we have a certain temperature range that we're happy to live within. Similarly, a certain humidity range. We don't like to be too wet. And I'm going to say a few things about sea level rise. So clearly, we'd prefer not to live below sea level. I suppose there's a few parts of the world that are below sea level, but you know what I mean. And similarly, we get into trouble if there isn't enough water as well. We need water to drink, we need water for crops, and so on. And also, of course, in terms of health, there are various conditions that allow us to live without too many diseases causing too many problems. And I suppose this statement, the developed world in many ways can control its local environment to some extent at least. So an obvious example, I'm going to talk about heat waves. An obvious example is we could wholesale install air conditioning, and indeed lots of societies around the world live in fairly extreme environments already and survive because they can resort to air conditioning to have some respite from those extreme temperatures and humidities. But I suppose the context is that a large fraction of the world doesn't have those luxuries, certainly not at the moment, and they're much more exposed to changes in the environment. So there are basically different areas of the world that are much more sensitive. And the main thing, or the main environmental factors that really impact people are extreme events. And of course, we're expecting climate change over the next century and onwards. And climate change, I mean, this sounds obvious, climate change will influence extreme weather. And some of a lot of the things that I'm going to say are, I think, fairly obvious, but I think there are some subtleties as well that aren't quite as straightforward to follow. So I wanted to start really by talking about climate change, and just to introduce the topic, this is not really the extreme weather bit, but I wanted to just introduce some basics about climate change. And this is perhaps the most familiar figure that you'll have come across when confronted with climate change. This is the first figure in the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change latest report, 2013. So this is the global average temperature record from 1850 up to present day. And we've seen about 0.8 degrees warming. It doesn't really matter whether you look at it a decadal average or as this running annual mean. I did want to say a few words about the fact that there are, you'll see that there are a few different colours on this graph. So these are three different data sets. Three different groups around the world have looked at how global temperatures have changed, and I wanted to drill down a little bit into this to where it's come from. So one of these groups is the Climatic Research Unit at University of East Anglia. Yes, those evil people at East Anglia, and I just wanted to be a little bit controversial. So you'll have been well aware, this is about the 5th anniversary actually, so this is from November the 20th, 2009. So 5 years ago, we were all in the run-up to Copenhagen Climate Summit, and of course, ClimateGate, you could hardly have avoided it. I think you know what I'm talking about. So papers like The Telegraph were loving all this. And of course, their main target was the Climatic Research Unit at East Anglia. Really, that graph that I just showed you, they were trying to point out that there was dubious things going on with it. Well, there isn't really a lot wrong with this graph, actually, and that has slowly emerged over the intervening time period. And I suppose one of the groups that initially were quite sceptical and quite, they sort of didn't like the fact that a lot of that data that went into this curve was maybe not very transparent. So people at Berkeley University in California went away and reanalyzed all the data, and hey presto, they came up with the same curve after all of that effort. And basically, hats off to them. They've done a nice job, and they've now come out and said, we're perfectly happy with the way the data's been used, and we are, pretty happy that this is a real representation of the data. And the other good thing is that they've produced a nice website where you can actually go in and look at some of the data, and this is really quite nice. So this is the same curve that I just showed you. This is the global temperature anomaly, plotted slightly differently, but about 0.8 degrees warming. If anything, they actually found very slightly more warming. But you can decompose this now. This is really just to show you some data, and I'm going to come back to, you don't really need to take all this in, but this is just showing you can not look at just the whole Earth, you can just look at the land. You get a slightly different picture. We can look at Europe. Again, there's a bit more warming now, so there's maybe 1.5 degrees on that curve, something like that. We can just look at the United Kingdom. You will see that it's getting a bit noisier now because we're coming down to a regional scale, and it's more difficult to actually calculate an average over a smaller area. And indeed, we can just look at Edinburgh. And indeed, that global curve, of course, is made up of vast amounts of data collected over the last couple of centuries by meteorologists who have been meticulous about the way they've collected the data. So really, I just wanted to illustrate where some of the data where we think global warming, or some of the really hard evidence that global warming is happening, it's not just drawn out of thin air, it is real global environmental data that has been meticulously collected over a long period of time. And I wanted to sort of show you this sort of data because I'm going to use this now to sort of think about extremes. So I think one of the things that perhaps isn't quite so well appreciated is that climate has natural variability associated with it. So you'll see on here a 10-year moving average is the red curve. But the black lines on here are just year-to-year variations. And you can see some very hot years and some relatively cold years. And this is also very relevant when you're thinking about how you actually interpret what this data really means. So in terms of extremes, I'm just going to now give you a very slightly boring definition, but I think we need a definition to get started. And then talk through some basic statistics of, so I'm not a statistician, don't get too worried, but I think there are good ways of actually thinking about how you think about what an extreme event actually is. So let me just talk through this. So this is, I've called this a dry definition because it's a little bit boring. Anyway, so a climate extreme, so this is how IPCC defines things, and you'll see various references to their special report on extremes from 2012. So a lot of my figures and so on are coming from this source. So a climate extreme is an occurrence of a value of a weather or climate variable above or below a threshold value near the upper or lower ends of the range of observed values of the variable. So it is a bit boring. Anyway, so diagrammatically, I think the easiest way to think about this is with a picture that looks something like this. So if I just go back to one of these temperature records, we can take all those individual years and we can basically plot up a probability density function of how often a particular temperature occurs. And we end up with a kind of bell-shaped curve. Okay, this is a perfect example, but just if you look at the non-dashed curve to start with, and on this axis we've got temperatures, and on the y-axis going upwards we've got the probability of that temperature occurring. So we've got the mean in the middle here and a variation around that. And really the point of this curve is just to show you where the extremes are, and also to point out what's written at the top here, that a very small shift in our mean temperature, so we might think that 0.8 degrees warming globally, well, that doesn't sound very much, it changes day to day by 10 degrees and, I can live with that. But the point is, a very small change in the mean actually has quite big implications for the tails of this distribution. So if you look at the amount of red here, this is extremely hot days. Under our initial climate, we had only a very small number of those, but we rapidly increased. So this is more than maybe 3 or 4 times the number of days with a very small change in the mean. And there are other things we can do with this diagram, of course. So climate may not just warm, the variability may increase, and this may be just as damaging as a shift in the mean climate, again, because of the impacts on the extremes of this distribution. And it's usually in these extremes, of course, where the real impacts on society actually occur. So in this case, we're just talking about hot and cold weather, but of course this applies to any climate variable, really. And I suppose one other thing to point out is that this distribution doesn't necessarily need to be symmetric about the mean. In reality, it may be a little bit skewed one way or the other. And again, that may have implications. So we may not change one end of the distribution, but we may change the other end. Okay, so that's really just to get you thinking about how we define extremes and what we're going to be talking about. So, as I said, I think at the start, I'm not really an expert on extreme weather. I'm actually an atmospheric chemist, as Dave introduced. So I kind of combed through the literature and I came up with this list of things, of examples of extreme weather. And I'm not going to talk about all of these because I've only got half an hour or less. So I'm going to mention heat waves is an obvious one. And while thinking about heat waves, I wondered why we don't call why don't we call them cold waves? We call them cold snaps, really, don't we? But maybe there's actually a difference between these two things. Cold snaps seems to suggest quite short time periods. Waves suggests quite long time periods. Anyway, I'm not even sure whether that's the right term for a cold period. We don't tend to talk about them very much. Anyway, enough nonsense. Right, so floods as well. So clearly, if we change the hydrological cycle as we are doing, we will have impacts on floods, and this is where we can also have an impact. And I'm going to say a few things about coastal flooding, really from a sea level change perspective. We can also change precipitation. These are the grayed out things that I'm not really going to say very much about, but again, we can change floods through changes in the intensity of precipitation. We think that precipitation events are going to become more intense, and also through just more precipitation over a large area, regional scale flooding that we quite often see as well. Droughts is a big issue. I've got one slide about droughts. We could have easily spent the whole evening talking about droughts, but I'm not really going to focus on that. And a few words about storms. There is actually very, or much less evidence that storms themselves, tropical cyclones, hurricanes and so on, are going to change, and this is quite a controversial area, so I'm kind of steering away from talking too much about storms, but the evidence seems to be that actually the numbers of storms may even go down in a changed climate. So I think we have to be a little bit careful when we talk about climate change. Not everything is going to get worse and more extreme and so on, so we have to, think a little bit harder than just saying everything goes up, I think. Okay. So the first topic really I want to show you a bit of an example about is heat waves. And I've got a few slides that look a little bit like this, and I've pulled out quotes from this IPCC report. These are their sort of headline quotes, so I'm kind of sticking to this story. So basically, models project substantial warming in temperature extremes by the end of the 21st century. So not a big surprise, really, that heat waves are going to feature. So let me spend a little time on this picture. I think this is quite a nice illustration of what the anatomy, if you like, of a heat wave looks like. So this is the heat wave that Dave mentioned in the introduction. So this is summer 2003. Some of you may be old enough to remember summer 2003. I guess it's getting 11 years old now, but anyway. So this was an extreme event, and it was over a very large area. So we've got a map of Europe here, and the colour contours on here, this is a little bit complicated, so the colour contours on here are the temperature anomaly for the summer. So this is how much hotter the summer was compared to a 30-year average. And you can see numbers up to 4 degrees, the orange colours in the centre of France and just about getting into Switzerland, I think. So again, 4 degrees doesn't sound like a huge amount. And the other thing on this diagram are the black lines. So the black lines don't line up with the colours. So they are the number of standard deviations away from the mean. So just to put that in a different context, this is the diagram I was showing you an example of a moment ago. So this is, the blue lines on here are every year of summer temperatures from 1864 up to 2003, up to 2002 actually. So 2003 sits out here at just over 22 degrees. So the green line here is just a bell-shaped curve, normal distribution put through that data. And this is what the Swiss were expecting for their summers, a mean of about 17 degrees and a standard deviation of about 1 degree either side of that. So the warmest summer before 2003 was 1947, which was a couple of degrees warmer than average. So really this is just an illustration of how unusual this event was. So this is about 5 standard deviations away from the mean value. And it was fairly unprecedented in that context. It's a good way of putting these kind of climate extremes in some kind of context. And again, this map just illustrates that this was widespread. It wasn't just Switzerland, it was the whole of Central Europe for a long period of time that experienced very high temperatures. And it took a little while to actually work this out, but basically by analysing the death statistics, so this is a publication from 4 years later, 2008, that I've got a couple of pictures from in the next slides. About 70,000 people are believed to have died simply because of this heat wave. So this is, you will sometimes see statistics about how many deaths are associated with climate change or projections and so on. And this is one of the sort of ways that we can get to those kind of numbers and have some confidence that they aren't just plucked out of thin air. So this is a graph of the summer of 2003, looking at the number of excess deaths. So basically this is with reference to a period 5 years, the 5 preceding years, and just looking at how many people die on particular days across Europe. Collating all of that data, you come up with something that looks like this. And basically, if you integrate under that curve, you see this big peak in August. That the main period of very high temperatures was the first 2 weeks of August. And you get several thousand deaths per day extra, and you integrate all of those, that's where you get this number of 70,000 from. Again, I'm not going to go into the actual mechanisms that people died, but basically heat stroke and so on were a big effect. And you can sort of see that the preceding months were just really within the noise, but it was during the intense period of the heat wave that lots of people died. This is from the same paper. So again, this is just breaking it down regionally to see where those deaths occurred. And as Dave was saying earlier, a lot of them were in central France. Paris was very badly affected, and other regions of Europe as well. The UK, to some extent, particularly London, was quite badly affected as well. I quite like the units here. So these, this is French for nomenclature des unités. I don't know, I can't speak French anyway. Nuts, these are the little regions anyway. I thought I quite like that. Anyway, So the other thing about the heat wave is that we think a fraction of those deaths were not just due to the heat, but they were also due to air pollution. So this guy, John Steadman, did a statistical analysis and worked out around a third of those deaths over the UK. So I'm not quite sure that anybody's looked wider than the UK, but sort of extrapolating to Europe is probably fairly safe. That about a third of the deaths were actually associated with air pollution. So particular particulate matter, PM10, and ozone. And we can sort of understand this because during a heat wave, hot, sunny, stagnant conditions, they're ideal for ozone formation. And the fact that it's stagnant, you don't dilute away that pollution, so it builds up to quite high levels. One of the things that I did want to point out, I'm not really going to say a lot about this, even though this is a little bit more my research area. One of the things to point out is that although a lot of this is coming from pollution from industry and so on, there are significant natural sources of some of this pollution. So, for example, some plants, such as oak trees, emit quite a lot of an ozone precursor called isoprene, hydrocarbon, C5H8. And that is thought to be responsible for a significant amount of the extra ozone that we saw during the heat wave. And similarly, one of the big sinks for ozone in the atmosphere is uptake by plants. But during a heat wave, they're under so much stress that they close their stomata. They don't take up that pollution nearly as efficiently. So again, these two things contribute to higher levels of pollution. So even if we, this is really just to point out that it's partly a man-made additional effect on top of the heat wave, but it's also something that is just a climate feedback and actually is just affecting, is brought about through changes in the natural processes that remove ozone from the atmosphere or produce it in the first place. So this really just adds to the things we need to worry about when we're trying to control air pollution during these sorts of events. Okay, so the big point about heat waves, of course, is that temperatures are projected to increase. We've only seen this black curve here. This is this 0.8 degrees warming up to present day. And of course, the projections for climate change are several degrees warming, even under the most optimistic scenarios. So this is a range of different climate scenarios out to the future, from a very optimistic one, the blue one, to a probably more realistic or arguably more pessimistic one, which is maybe warming of 4 degrees global average temperatures on the red curve. So what does this mean for heat waves? Well, fairly obviously we're going to have more heat waves, but this is quite a nice analysis by Peter Stott in Nature shortly after this summer 2003 heat wave. So this was looking at model output from the Hadley Centre model, and you can just about pick out the heat wave if 2003 is, so the black curve here is the real temperature data, and you can see the 2003 heat wave just here. And then if you look at the projections and you just make a simple step forward, you can see by 2050 or even before 2050, those kind of conditions become commonplace. So basically that's happening pretty much every year by around 2045 or something like that. So this again is the way we can use statistics to point out that those very rare events now will become essentially commonplace within a very short period of time, really. Okay, so that was heat waves, maybe nothing that interesting or less. It was fairly obvious, really, that global warming is going to increase the frequency of heat waves, I think. So another impact, really, I wanted to briefly mention is sea level rise. So hand in hand with higher temperatures, we have changes in sea level. And I think there are quite important implications, particularly for coastal flooding. So again, the statement from this IPCC report that is it's very likely, so they use these phrases like very likely, so that means basically a 90% chance that mean sea level rise will contribute to upwards trends in extreme coastal high water levels in the future. So really what we're talking about with coastal flooding is this normally is associated with the passage of a storm, like a low pressure system. And in particular, you may remember 1953 in the North Sea, but also much more recently, last November, probably about a year ago now, there was a very similar sized event in the North Sea that caused lots of flooding. Didn't really cause as many fatalities as 1953, and that's simply because we've got better coastal defences now and we were prepared for it. But it was very close to being a very serious event, and those will only become more frequent. So anyway, the biggest hazard associated with storms often is coastal flooding. For example, Hurricane Katrina. A lot of the lives lost due to Hurricane Katrina was flooding of New Orleans. So I wasn't really sure if drowning fits into health as an impact, but it's a fairly obvious impact as far as I'm concerned. But of course, there are sort of less direct impacts with coastal flooding. You'll be affecting drinking water, infiltration of aquifers, polluting them with salt and so on. And again, longer term things like we see lots of pictures of people's houses flooded in the UK, and of course that displaces people and they have to go back to damp houses. There's lots of associated problems. And of course, waterborne diseases are going to be affected by these kind of things as well. Now, in terms of numbers of storms, the frequency and intensity of storms, there are slightly, there's basically low confidence in what's going to happen with storms. But we are pretty sure that the sea levels are going to rise. And indeed, they have risen already this century. So we've had about 20 centimetres of sea level rise over the 20th century. Very well documented. Again, this is an IPCC figure looking at some different analyses, but they're pretty consistent with each other. And indeed, if we go into the future, the projections are of this order. Again, the low emission scenario, maybe another 40 centimetres or so of sea level rise, up to maybe a metre's sea level rise. And I know there's lots of people that actually think these are relatively conservative estimates, but I think we go with IPCC, and I don't like to take extreme values and scare people. I just like to take, in many ways, it's better to take the low values, I think, that are coming out of these projections, because they're equally, or nearly as equally scary anyway. So what is the impact of a relatively modest change in sea level? So again, we've done modelling, people have done modelling to look at this kind of thing, and it doesn't take very much change in sea level to have quite a big impact on coastal flooding events. And I think this is nicely illustrated with this diagram, which is a little bit complicated. But basically, this is a return period diagram. So on this axis, we've got return period on a log axis. And on this side, we've got the size of the flooding or the coastal flooding event. And this is quite often used for looking at extreme events and looking at how often they're going to occur. So currently, a 1.5 metre event occurs about every 120 years. And if we fast forward to the future, raise sea level by about half a metre. Okay, I haven't got too much to go. If we raise sea level by 50 centimetres, that's quite near the low end of those future scenarios. That 120-year event happens every 7 years. So that's sort of changing from a once-in-a-lifetime event, assuming you live 120 years, but that's, to something that's happening pretty much, every 7 years. So that's quite frequent. And I think really this brings home the fact that we're near that tail of the distribution, and you can change things dramatically by relatively small changes in the mean sea level. So I think this is likely to be a big impact. And of course, we're seeing this already. So this is real data. This is the Thames Barrier in London, installed in 1983, supposed to be used, I think, once every decade when it was installed. And in 2014, okay, there's lots of year-to-year variability, but that last year it was used 48 times. Kind of scary. And this is really just all to do, it's partly to do with higher levels of precipitation last winter, but also to do with changes in sea level. So this is really happening already, is the point. Just a few quick words before I pass on about other things. Maybe I will leave you to read these, but these are, of course, changes in precipitation are expected, and that will affect both floods and droughts. And again, we're expecting changes in the intensity and the total amount of rainfall to go up. But rainfall is a slightly more complicated story than temperatures. There are regional differences, and things are a little bit more complicated. But anyway, in the interest of time, I will skip through these. So this is really just changes in annual precipitation. So this is what's happened over the last 50 years or so. And in broad summary, what's happened is the wet regions of the world, high latitudes that we're in, the blue regions on here, have got wetter, and the dry parts of the world, in particular the Sahel and the Mediterranean and so on, have got drier. And this is what we're projecting to happen even more so with climate change. We think this is the sort of climate change signature of changes in precipitation. So that's going to bring about problems both in those blue regions where we're going to expect more rainfall, more flooding, and in the dry regions, more stress on water supplies and so on. So it's not just the total amount of rainfall, but it's also the intensity of rainfall that changes. Again, the blue crosses here are regions over the last 50 years or so where we've seen increases in the intensity of rainfall. So this will have a big impact on flash floods, for example, and things like landslides and so on. And really this is looking at drought, again, large areas of the world, looking at drought indices. We're expecting drought to become more prevalent, not simply just through less rainfall in those areas, but also changes in the soil moisture and changes in the evaporation and evapotranspiration and so on, that is reflected in this drought index. I haven't really got any time to talk about drought. But really, I think this is the last thing I wanted to say, was that not everything is clear-cut. So changes in storms are a more complicated story, I think. And I think reading what IPCC says about storms is that we're expecting actually the numbers of storms individually to go down in most cases, but potentially their intensities to go up. But there is a lot less certainty about these sorts of things. So with that, this is just a list of some of the things that I drew from. I will pass over to Becky to give a slightly different perspective on the same.
Thank you, David.